I have spent the last 48 hours cross-referencing naval intercept logs, KPLR crude tracking data, Lloyd's List maritime intelligence, and CENTCOM operational dispatches. And what I'm seeing right now is not what any mainstream financial outlet is telling you. They are framing this as a diplomatic standoff, a negotiating impasse, something that will resolve itself at a table in Islamabad or Doha. It will not. What I am looking at is a live dual blockade scenario in one of the most kinetically volatile maritime corridors on the planet, one that is quietly building toward a pressure threshold that, once breached, will not be walked back in 72 hours. It will cascade for weeks. Here is what the cable news cycle is completely missing. Iran has not simply closed the Strait of Hormuz as a negotiating tactic. Tehran has operationalized the strait itself as a weapon system. The IRGC is no longer defending a waterway. It is weaponizing a choke point that handles 20% of the world's seaborne oil and 20% of its LNG. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy, operating under CENTCOM Admiral Brad Cooper since April 13th, has established a counter-blockade of Iranian ports, intercepting vessels, seizing Iranian-flagged tankers as far away as Asian waters, and projecting naval force across an operational theater that stretches from the Persian Gulf to the Indian Ocean. The mainstream narrative says both sides are talking. What the data tells me is that both sides are simultaneously talking and escalating, and history is unambiguous about what happens when two nuclear-adjacent powers try to do both at the same time in a geographic kill zone 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. I've watched analysts dismiss sea drone saturation attacks as nuisances. I've watched insurance underwriters get caught flat-footed when a VLCC takes a hit 800 kilometers from the strait itself. I've watched Trump threaten to bomb Iran back to the Stone Ages, while Marco Rubio privately pours cold water on the one diplomatic off-ramp Tehran is offering. What I am about to walk you through is not geopolitical theater. This is a real-time siege economy playing out across the world's most critical energy artery, and the next 72 hours are the operational window that will determine whether this is a crisis or a collapse. To understand why every conventional military and economic playbook fails at the Strait of Hormuz, you must first understand the geography, because the strait is not simply a body of water. It is a geographic constraint that converts every assumption of Western naval doctrine into a liability. The Strait of Hormuz connects the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and ultimately to global seaborne commerce. At its narrowest, the navigable shipping lane is just 2 miles wide in each direction. 2 lanes of global energy supply compressed into a channel that sits partly within Iranian territorial waters and partly within Omani waters. There is no alternative route for the Arabian Gulf's landlocked petroleum. The pipelines that bypass the strait, the East-West pipeline through Saudi Arabia, the Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline, carry a fraction of what transits the strait. They are relief valves, not substitutes. Pre-conflict, this waterway processed approximately 3,000 vessel transits per month. As of April 2026, that number has collapsed to roughly 5% of pre-war levels. The world's most critical energy corridor is, in operational terms, effectively closed. Now layer the physics of asymmetric naval warfare onto this geography. The Persian Gulf is a shallow, enclosed body of water averaging only 50 meters in depth, a bathtub by naval standards. This depth profile severely limits the survivability of large surface combatants and eliminates the threat suppression advantages that nuclear-powered carrier strike groups project in open ocean environments. Acoustic detection is degraded, thermal layering is extreme, anti-submarine warfare, one of the U.S. Navy's core dominance pillars, is compromised by the Gulf's acoustic environment. The terrain above the waterline is equally punishing. The Zagros mountain range descends toward the Iranian coastline at the northeastern edge of the strait, providing elevated terrain ideal for mobile missile batteries and coastal defense systems. Iranian shore-based anti-ship missile systems, including the domestically produced Noor and Qatar cruise missile platforms, can be repositioned continuously, degrading the predictability that U.S. targeting cycles depend upon. IRGC fast attack craft operating in swarm configurations exploit the strait's cluttered maritime environment where GPS spoofing, electromagnetic interference, and proximity to civilian infrastructure constrain U.S. rules of engagement. This is not a theater where the United States Navy fights from a position of superiority. It is a theater where American naval power fights at a geographic disadvantage against a force that has spent 4 decades optimizing specifically for this kill zone. Iran's entire asymmetric naval doctrine is built around one fundamental truth, that the United States cannot sustain indefinite kinetic dominance inside a 21-mile-wide corridor without triggering cascading consequences, militarily, diplomatically, and economically, that dwarf the cost of the original objective. Western naval planners trained on open ocean power projection, carrier strike group doctrine, and battle space dominance are operating inside an environment that systematically negates their advantages. That operational reality is not a talking point, it is a physics problem, and physics does not negotiate. The dual blockade scenario now unfolding in and around the Strait of Hormuz represents one of the most complex multi-domain maritime confrontations since the Second World War. To understand its mechanics, it must be broken down across 3 operational layers: the Iranian denial architecture, the U.S. enforcement posture, and the contested gray zone between them, where kinetic incidents are now occurring with alarming frequency. Following the U.S.-Israeli strikes on February 28, 2026, which killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and targeted IRGC command infrastructure, Tehran immediately activated its pre-planned Strait denial doctrine. The IRGC did not attempt to fight the United States Navy in a conventional engagement. It executed a distributed denial strategy centered on 5 kinetic instruments. First, sea mine deployment. The IRGC laid mines in the Strait's navigable channels, forcing commercial vessels to halt AIS broadcasting entirely. By March 2nd, no tankers in the Strait were transmitting automatic identification system signals, effectively rendering maritime traffic surveillance blind. This is not an accident. It is deliberate electromagnetic concealment designed to maximize insurer risk calculations and trigger war risk premium escalation. Second, sea drone strikes at extended range. The most significant tactical revelation of this conflict is the operational radius of Iranian maritime drones. The oil tanker Sonangol Namibe was struck by a sea drone while anchored at Mubarak al-Kabir port in Kuwait, over 800 kilometers from the strait itself. This is a force projection capability that fundamentally redefines the threat envelope. Iranian sea drones are not straight defense weapons. They are region-wide area denial weapons. Third, coastal missile engagement. On March 6th, a tugboat dispatched to assist the stricken vessel Safine Prestige was struck by 2 missiles and subsequently sank. This targeting of a rescue vessel demonstrates IRGC doctrine's willingness to create secondary casualty events that suppress follow-on emergency response, a classic area denial escalation technique. Fourth, fast attack vessel interdiction. IRGC Navy fast attack boats have boarded and seized foreign-flagged vessels attempting unauthorized transit, converting the strait into a de facto customs checkpoint under military enforcement. Iranian First Vice President Mohammad Reza Aref formalized this on April 19th with a blunt declaration: the security of the Strait of Hormuz is not free. Fifth, port-level interdiction. Iran has closed the strait entirely to foreign shipping in retaliation for the U.S. naval blockade, capturing several foreign-flagged vessels as leverage assets, effectively building a hostage ship portfolio to complicate U.S. escalation decisions. Beginning April 13th, under CENTCOM authority and the operational command of Admiral Brad Cooper, the U.S. Navy imposed a counter-blockade targeting all vessels transiting to and from Iranian ports. The 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit and the destroyer USS Spruance executed the first direct enforcement action on April 19th, seizing the Iranian-flagged vessel Tuska. As of late April, the U.S. had intercepted a total of 23 vessels. Additionally, the U.S. Navy has extended its enforcement posture into Asian waters, intercepting at least 3 Iranian-flagged tankers attempting to reach Asian customers, effectively converting what began as a strait-level blockade into a global maritime interdiction campaign against Iranian crude exports. Trump claimed the blockade is costing Iran approximately $500 million per day. Between these 2 enforcement architectures exists a contested operational space where neither side has achieved decisive dominance. As of April 20th, Lloyd's List confirmed that at least 26 vessels had managed to bypass the U.S. blockade line in both directions. Meanwhile, Iran has continued exporting its own crude through the waterway, a critical asymmetry. The U.S. blockade targets ships going to and from Iranian ports, but Iran remains the gatekeeper of the transit corridor itself. This creates a tactical paradox. The United States is blockading Iran's ports while Iran blockades the world's oil supply. Washington is applying economic pressure. Tehran is applying systemic pressure. These are not equivalent instruments. One threatens Iran's revenue. The other threatens the world's energy supply chain and every Western economy connected to it. The operational conclusion is stark. The U.S. Navy has significant enforcement capability but incomplete denial capability. Iran has incomplete enforcement capability but near-complete denial capability at the choke point itself. This asymmetry is not a stalemate. It is a slow-motion escalation ladder, with each rung bringing the theater closer to the kinetic threshold neither side has officially crossed. The Strait of Hormuz crisis is no longer a regional military event. It has metastasized into a systemic shock to the global energy architecture, one with second and third order consequences that are already reshaping commodity markets, insurance structures, sovereign fiscal calculations, and the foundations of dollar-denominated energy trade. Before February 28, 2026, the Strait of Hormuz processed approximately 20% of the world's seaborne oil and 20% of its LNG in normal conditions. That flow has effectively ceased for the majority of commercial operators. The near shutdown of this critical choke point triggered an immediate spiral in global oil and gas prices. The macro effect is not hypothetical. It is already embedded in consumer fuel prices across the United States and Europe. Arab Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, were forced to cut or suspend oil production due to Iranian attacks on port infrastructure, compressing global supply from both ends simultaneously. Iran, paradoxically, has continued exporting its own crude through the waterway it controls, exploiting the asymmetry of its gatekeeping position. According to Kepler trade intelligence data, Iran exported 1.84 million barrels per day in March 2026. Even as it denied passage to the rest of the world. This is mercantilist leverage of the highest order. The most structurally consequential development for global shipping is not the military engagement itself. It is the collapse of the war risk insurance market for the Strait. Protection and indemnity insurance, the critical underwriting layer that enables commercial shipping to operate, effectively ceased to function for Hormuz-adjacent transits. By March 5th, war risk coverage for the Strait had been pulled entirely, making the economic risk for ship owners prohibitive, regardless of the military calculus. When Lloyd's and the P&I clubs walk away from a corridor, the corridor closes commercially, irrespective of naval presence. This insurance collapse has a direct transmission mechanism into global inflation. Shipping costs for Gulf origin crude are now reflected in elevated LNG spot prices, fuel surcharges, and petrochemical feedstock costs across European and Asian manufacturing chains. The inflationary impulse is not contained to the Middle East. It is distributed across every economy that imports energy, which is nearly every economy on the planet. The U.S. naval blockade has generated a second-order geopolitical consequence that Washington appears to have underestimated. It has aligned China and Russia in explicit opposition to American naval enforcement. On April 7th, China and Russia vetoed a UN Security Council resolution calling for an end to Iranian attacks and coordinated defensive shipping access. China subsequently condemned the U.S. blockade as irresponsible and dangerous, arguing it would exacerbate tensions and undermine the already fragile ceasefire. Beijing's position is not merely rhetorical. China is the primary buyer of Iranian crude, and a fully enforced U.S. blockade targeting Iranian exports threatens Beijing's energy security calculus directly. Perhaps the most precise economic intelligence emerging from this crisis is the sustainability timeline for Iran's leverage position. According to analysis reported by Al Jazeera, Tehran's existing crude stockpiles aboard hundreds of waiting tankers could sustain revenue flows through approximately August 2026, despite the U.S. naval blockade. That 5-month runway fundamentally alters the diplomatic and military timeline. As one analyst framed it bluntly, does President Trump have until August? Probably not. Iran has publicly offered to reopen the strait if the U.S. lifts its blockade and formally ends the war. a proposal Trump's national security team discussed as recently as April 28th. Secretary of State Marco Rubio's response was cold. The offer remains unaccepted. Every day of continued closure is another $1 billion transferred from global energy consumers to the geopolitical contest playing out in a 21-mile-wide corridor. I want to be direct with you about where this ends, because there is no clean resolution here. There are only two paths, and both of them are bad. Washington can escalate kinetically, execute direct strikes on Iranian coastal missile infrastructure, IRGC naval assets, and port facilities on Karg Island to force the strait open by force. That pathway risks drawing China and Russia deeper into the conflict in defense of their energy supply chains, triggering a naval engagement in a geographic theater that systematically disadvantages American surface combatants, and almost certainly guaranteeing an Iranian retaliatory strike on Gulf state energy infrastructure that collapses Saudi and Emirati production simultaneously. You blow the strait open and simultaneously ignite every petrochemical asset in the Arabian Gulf. Congratulations. You've opened one artery and severed three others, or Washington negotiates, lifts the naval blockade, accepts Iran's framework, postpones the nuclear conversation, and tacitly acknowledges that the IRGC successfully weaponized 21 miles of water against the world's largest navy. That is not a peace deal. That is a strategic defeat dressed in diplomatic language, and every adversary from Beijing to Pyongyang to Moscow is taking notes. There is no good path. There is only the path we take and the consequences that follow. I want to hear your tactical assessment. Kinetic escalation or negotiated withdrawal? Drop it in the comments below. If this briefing gave you something the mainstream media didn't, subscribe and turn on notifications. Tomorrow's briefing covers the IRGC's sea mine doctrine and exactly what happens to global LNG markets if the strait goes fully dark. Stay sharp.